Hi, and welcome to the Mediatwits number 144. We'll be talking about newspapers and whether less print frequency can help give newspapers long-term survival. Advance Newspapers, a private company, said that their digital revenues had actually surpassed the loss of print ad revenues for the first time. That's something that watchers have been looking at in the newspaper industry for a while to see whether digital can actually sustain them. We'll be talking about all those and whether there's other things and other revenue streams that might save newspapers. What's the future of newspapers, and will there be less print in their future? First, we want to thank our sponsor. Running your own business requires focus, and so does parenting. Mediatwits podcast sponsor NextSpace created a place where parents could give their best quality of attention to both co-working space and childcare space under one roof. Learn more at nextspace.us/nextkids. And indeed, I am coming to you from NextSpace, and my one-year-old son Everett is next door in the kids space, which is great. So before we get into our discussion, I want to introduce our panel. We have Andrew Lih from American University in D.C. joining us. We have Jesse Holcomb from the Pew Research Center in D.C. We have Martin Langeveld, media analyst, joining us from Vermont. We have Ryan Chittum, contributing editor from CJR in Seattle, and our producer Jefferson Yen in Los Angeles. So this new memo that came from Randy Siegel at Advance said that and Advance, let's first say that 5 years ago they lowered the frequency of their print publications. Rather than being daily, they were a few times a week, and this, especially in New Orleans, that there was a huge backlash against them for doing that. And now they're saying, I mean, they're private, so it's hard to say exactly what's going on, but they're saying now their digital. There's always been this talk about, can digital dimes replace print dollars that are going away for newspapers, and now they're basically saying this is happening. Martin, what's your take? I know you had a long piece in Neiman Lab about this, but do you think less print is one of the answers for newspaper companies?
Yes, I think it is. First of all, if you just think about this business model, if newspapers didn't exist, and then somebody said, well, we're going to cut down trees in Canada, and we're going to turn them into paper and so forth, and then, print news on it, and then we're going to drive all over creation, shove it into tubes in front of people's houses, and then you can read the news. People would say you're crazy. So it really is kind of outmoded in this digital age. That's number one. I think the bigger thing is that until you decide that you really want to be a digital business, and you create a truly digital newsroom, and then you let everything else flow from that, you're not really on the right track. But I think that if you do that, you say, you know what, we're going to deliver news digitally 24/7, and we're only going to print it to the extent that it'll pay for itself. And I think these days it's not hard to see that 2, 3, 4 times a week the paper really isn't paying for itself.
Right, and a lot of newspapers have gone from being kind of free online to, putting up paywalls, and now with apps that they would charge for. Advance doesn't even have paywalls, so what do you think their prospects are in, really relying heavily on advertising online?
Yeah, well, even Advance, I think, is getting a huge amount of advertising still in print. And I think this is the point, is that print is not dead. It's just that 7-day print is no longer viable. Newspapers have done a lot of incremental steps over the last 20 years that they've been trying to cope with disruption from the internet. It's time for them to just make a much bigger, more strategic leap into publishing once or twice or maybe 3 times a week, and I think Advance is showing that works. They did it a few times way back when up in Michigan, and they didn't stop. If it wasn't working for them, they wouldn't have done all these papers out to Syracuse and New Orleans and Cleveland and so forth, they would have reversed course. It's working for them. It should work for a lot of other papers.
Hey, Ryan, why do you think not a lot of other organizations are following in their footsteps? If less print is better, why are we still seeing so many daily papers all over?
Well, like any question with the newspaper industry, there's no good answers. So that's the ultimate problem. If you reduce your print frequency, you know people have a habit. They have generally your subscribers have a 7-day habit. You have maybe 5%, 10% that pick up a paper here and there at the newsstand. But if you break that habit, then people will, you know, if you go to 3 days a week, then maybe they don't need to read it at all. So that's one of the dangers that people are concerned about. You know, and your print newspaper still accounts for the bulk of revenue, something like 85% probably industry-wide. So I think they're just very concerned about doing anything that harms their main revenue source. Although, you know, I mean, it's the problem is that revenue source is dying, clearly. So at some point you have to figure out what to do about that. Is it to reduce print frequency? Can you get digital revenue up enough to, you know, counteract the print loss, or do you cut your staff enough to keep yourself profitable? That's what newspapers have done really over the last 7-8 years is cut, and I don't think it's worked.
Yeah. And what have you seen, Jesse? I mean, we're looking at the last State of the News report from Pew, where, you know, newspaper revenues have obviously it's the opposite of the hockey stick. It's going down. It looks like it's somewhat stabilizing in the last few years. I mean, do you think there's a chance things could at least, let's say, break even to the point where, you know, where print losses are I mean, what do you see in the trends in the last few years when it comes to newspapers? Is this all bad, or are there some signs of hope?
You see little pockets of growth here and there, a little bit of stabilization on the circulation side, a little bit of growth on the digital advertising side, and then, of course, in some of these other sort of miscellaneous categories of revenue. What you don't see is those smaller areas of revenue growth being able to really fill the hole that's being left by the consistent and significant decline in print advertising revenue. And in some cases, you also see the growth year over year in those other more promising categories begin to be smaller. So, you know, we'll wait till probably April or so to hear what 2014 looked like from the NAA's perspective, but I don't hold that any hope for any major surprises in terms of miraculous growth industry-wide. I think the elephant in the room is still the decline of print advertising revenue, and I don't see any major upward changes on the immediate horizon.
And what about mobile? I know there's been, if you look at the overall growth in digital revenues, there's a huge upswing and a lot of potential in video and mobile. Andrew, what's your take about, you know, if mobile could be, you know, part of the answer? I know New York Times has had some apps, and Washington Post just put out its new app. And I mean, is this an area where newspapers can kind of transform themselves?
Yeah, I'd be interested to hear from the panel on what they think about mobile, because of some of the pieces that we read this week talk strictly about generically online and newspapers, but didn't really break down mobile. And one of the things I did in December was spend a week out in Silicon Valley talking about the coming mobile majority, right? So if you look at the numbers right now, already after 5 p.m. on weekdays and all the weekends, you're already seeing most news sites having the majority of their accesses from mobile. And the trend just looks like even within the 40-hour work week from 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, you're bound to get mobiles going above desktops and laptops. So my kind of odd theory might be that as we get more and more used to news on smaller and smaller screens, in fact, the newspaper as a once-a-week thing that you get on weekends might actually be the foil to that, right? We're reading on a tiny thing, but then suddenly we have this double truck wide form factor that we actually have the time on weekends to consume. And in fact, that's what I kind of do in my household, is that I finally have the time on the weekends to consume that newspaper. And on top of that are all the great things that newspapers like, which is the advertisements that you can fill on weekends for coupons and inserts and things like that. So we might have reached an equilibrium point with the rise of mobiles, and then providing people the right product at the right time, which is weekend reading of that paper newspaper.
Yeah, Martin, do you think that's true about this kind of new habit of maybe being on your devices during the week and then taking a break and wanting to relax with print on the weekend?
Yeah, I think that's the way it's developing, and certainly I've advocated back since 2008 that papers should focus on a weekend edition that comes out maybe Friday night, not Sunday. So you have all weekend to enjoy it. On the mobile side, I think the challenge for newspapers is just figuring it out and doing it right. The papers like the Washington Post, with some billionaire money behind them, New York Times, they have the resources to do that. But you got 1,400 other newspapers that still have a lot of legacy print salespeople, not a lot of digital sales talent. And, they're not going to be able to pull off this kind of Facebook miracle where Facebook was nowhere online and now they're one of the leaders in about 3 years' time. I don't see newspapers being able to pull that off.
Ryan, do you think there's any potential in mobile, or do you think it is going to be as much of a challenge as Martin said?
As much or more. I mean, the problem with mobile, the screen size, you have Facebook that's been hugely successful in mobile, but they have scale that no newspaper can possibly, or any news organization really can possibly hope to get. So they can afford to have these ad rates that are almost laughably low, but when you stack up 1 billion people, they add up, and they don't have the cost of creating the content. They have people doing it for them. So the question is whether mobile ultimate question is whether mobile could support a robust news gathering staff, and the way it stands now, I don't see it. I agree with Martin that, especially over the next 3, 4, 5 years, that papers should go seriously think about going to a one paper a week model, and I think that's where they're going to have to go anyway. They're printing editions Monday, Tuesday, etc., that just don't make money Saturday. And so if you can get an edition and somehow convince advertisers that this thing is still valuable, that people read it, that they look at advertisements, that they buy the paper in part for the advertisements, that's something that nobody does online. But boy, I mean, I'm glad I don't own a newspaper.
You don't want to get in on the digital first media sale process, huh?
No, I mean, I actually, on a lark, sort of started looking around at small town newspapers. I think it'd be fun to do that, and I think there's still a business model there. But these metro papers are it's just really, really difficult. I think that there needs to be some kind of, if you want to have a model where you have a centralized newsroom with a couple 300 people in it, then there needs to be some kind of nonprofit organization involved with it, basically. I don't see how the advertising right now is going to support this kind of news gathering, particularly on a local scale. You can do it on a national scale in some instances, but on a sort of regional and local scale, it's very, very difficult.
Right. So you're saying more of the Texas Tribune model is where some of these organizations might have to go.
Right.
Jesse, yeah, Jesse, I'm curious what you see is, you're talking about smaller papers. I mean, are we just talking about metro papers that are having the biggest problems, but maybe the national and the smaller weeklies and maybe suburban papers aren't suffering as much?
I think historically that's been the case, that these bigger metro papers have had a harder time than some of these smaller papers, community papers, weekly papers as well. But these are challenges that are really sort of systemic ones, and sooner or later you're going to experience these challenges, whether you're a big metro daily or something else, or a smaller community paper. And it's not just limited to print or newspapers as well. You know, you start to see some questions arise with the model for television and some of these other platforms too. So what you start to see happening early on with big metro dailies is filtering out, because this is just a major technological and economic information revolution that's still happening.
Right. And we also saw a report about the free dailies. You know, a few years ago, that was a big thing. And, you know, maybe in the early 2000s, you know, especially in Europe, a lot of the kind of commuter papers would just be handed out to people, and that became just a phenomenon where, you know, you're in London and just you see these papers just strewn about. But now even that's going down. I think they dropped in circulation by half. Andrew, do you think even that, the free daily idea, is even, you know, going towards mobile?
Yeah, I mean, I think can't think of a better correlation of, as the use of mobiles go up and as more people have smartphones and you have push notifications and social networking and everything, that free paper daily that you even try to shove in people's hands at the transit stations is just not going to hold up, right? So, you know, I still think that newspapers, you know, shouldn't feel like they need to go toe-to-toe with mobile news, right? It's like, you know, if it's going to be a gunfight, don't bring a knife. You know, use print and the fact that a physical chunk of stuff lands on someone's driveway once a week, and leverage that for content that is conducive to physical delivery, right? So, as I mentioned before, the fact that you can have lots of, high-resolution content in front of you, you can spread out the paper, you can mull it over slowly. Something that I thought that the tabloids in New York City did quite well to keep themselves relevant as print publications was to, especially around sports and other things, make collector's editions and make a reason why people want to get a physical copy of something. Don't just try to replicate what would show up on your mobile anyway. And I think publications that can take advantage of the physicality for a real purpose will stay relevant while getting the best of both worlds, right? Electronic delivery, Monday through Friday, and then weekend editions that are something that you crave. Because we've seen that companies or publications like The Economist have thrived during this digital era. There is a need and an appetite for analysis and a weekly digest of things, and I think there are ways to make that successful.
Yeah, but just obviously not in the daily print venue.
Right.
So now what we talk about also, there's a recent story from Ken Doctor at Nieman Lab talking about how can newspapers' business stabilize? And part of it was, obviously they're going to need to grow digital revenues, which has kind of slowed, and paywall revenues, which has kind of slowed. And then there's these kind of third wave of revenues, which are around all kinds of other things that they might offer. The Dallas Morning News has a bunch of startups that they've helped invest in, and around helping their audience grow, and kind of some digital startup companies. Ryan, do you think there's potential there in these kind of the other category for newspapers if they bring in startups, try to do more kind of community marketing? Is that an area that might work for them?
Probably not. Hate to be Debbie Downer.
You're just not optimistic, are you?
Yeah. The
you
problem,
won't be running the NAA anytime soon.
I'm going to apply for that job too. The problem with all this is it's super labor-intensive work. So if you're going to start a marketing services division, there's just not that many efficiencies you can get there. You got to have bodies, and the bodies are what cost money. And so, sure, you might be able to get a 5 or 7% profit margin on some of this stuff, but it's just not going to be enough to move the needle, most likely. That doesn't mean that people should stop experimenting with it, and hopefully they find something that really works, and anything helps. Any incremental revenue, profitable revenue helps. But I just don't think it's going to be an answer to the bigger issue, which is just the decline of not only print advertising but print circulation too.
Martin, do you agree? I mean, do you think there's some areas of hope when it comes to this kind of other revenue ideas from some of the newspaper companies?
Yeah, well, there's always other things you could do, but I agree that these things they're peripheral. They could be standalone businesses. Commercial printing, that's a standalone business. Doing marketing services for they tell merchants how to place better Google ads or something. That's a standalone business. Back in the 80s and 90s, the company that I worked for had a courier service. We had commercial printing. We even owned a health club for a while. But all of those things were peripheral and got sold off separately, not as part of the newspaper business.
Yeah. Do you agree with Ryan about things kind of moving towards the nonprofit model, and maybe that's a better way for some of these news organizations to survive?
Yeah, and I think an interesting way to think about this is that back in the sort of the monopoly days, news, the creation of news, the running of a good newsroom was really kind of a philanthropic enterprise on the part of publishers who were really in the business of selling advertising, because they were the only game in town, and they kind of competed with each other on who had the bigger, better newsroom and got more Pulitzers. And this was really the theory that John Thornton had when he started up the Texas Tribune. He said it's always been a philanthropic thing, and going forward, since the advertising isn't going to do it for us anymore, it really has to be a nonprofit organization.
And Jesse, what numbers do you see around nonprofits? I know when you do your big State of the News media, you've looked a little bit more at these kinds of, there's a whole network, the Investigative News Network, and there's some larger, like ProPublica and Center for Public Integrity that have been around for a long time. And there's also, of course, public media in the way, going to the public and asking for money directly. So is that going to become more dominant than some of these kind of metro dailies when it comes to news gathering locally?
Well, I don't know that I would say that become more dominant as a general source of daily news for these communities than metro dailies are anytime soon. In fact, what we saw when we basically estimated that there were about 175 nonprofit news websites, and this was from a couple of years ago, we found that only about a quarter of them were really doing what you'd call general interest news, so covering everything from sports to City Hall. Instead, the vast majority of them were focusing on one kind of a niche, so politics, investigative reporting, health, science, education, and so on. So that's what you see more often with these nonprofit newsrooms, the Marshall Project, even Texas Tribune, it's Texas Politics. So they're really sort of going after a different, perhaps a different slice of the audience, focusing on this sort of vertical, something that's more narrow where they can be the authority on these different topics. And we are seeing more of these newsrooms launching. Every once in a while, one folds or goes dormant, but I definitely think that it's sort of a development that's not going away anytime soon. Public radio continues to generate increasing amounts of their revenue through individual giving and memberships, and increasingly that's what you see at these digital nonprofits as well. So as they launch, they're trying to get buy-in from their community, their core audience right away. Say, do you want to be a part of this? This is what we're doing. We're trying to make your community smarter, make your government work better, and that's the model from the ground up for a lot of these organizations. So, it's fragile still, but it's here, and it's not going away anytime soon.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how these local ecosystems break down when it comes to some of the commercial players that have been there, the public media, the nonprofit, and even these kind of verticals in real estate and blogs and other things you see covering different local areas. It's really being split up and divided when you go online, right?
Yeah, I think it is. It's if I want to get my tire replaced, I'm going to go to a place that's called Just Tires, rather than to my general. At least these digital nonprofit newsrooms are kind of acting on that theory that they can go really deep on one or two specific areas and own that area. Texas Tribune has a huge out-of-state audience for what they cover because a lot of people who are thinking about politics or state politics, national and state level affairs, they think about Texas. They're thinking about the Texas Tribune for the way they own that niche.
All right, well, thanks. Appreciate you all joining us for the discussion. We'll definitely be seeing how things change in the years to come, and look forward to the new State of the News media report from Pew, and of course NAA's numbers when they come. We'll be checking that out. I want to thank our sponsor, NextSpace and NextKids. You can learn more about their program at nextspace.us/nextkids. I want to thank our panel, Andrew Lih from American University, Jesse Holcomb from Pew Research Center, Martin Langeveld, media analyst, Ryan Chittum, contributing editor for CJR, and Jefferson Yen, our producer. You can catch us every week at PBS MediaShift at pbs.org/MediaShift. We'll catch you next week.